My name's Erin Tobin. I'm Executive Director of Adirondack Architectural Heritage, and we are so happy to have everybody taking the time out of your afternoon to join us here today. This afternoon, you're going to hear from 5 speakers, experts in historic preservation, who will talk about historic tax credits and funding preservation projects. And that will be Beth Cumming, Senior Historic Site Restoration Coordinator from New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. William Floyd, Historic Preservation Technical Specialist, also from the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. You will also hear from Jason Yots, who's the President of Preservation Studios. Richard Rogers, who's President and General Counsel of Homeowner, and Amy Catania, Executive Director of Historic Saranac Lake, will wrap up this afternoon's webinar with a case study on her project with the Trudeau building in Saranac Lake, which is planning on using the state and federal historic tax credits. Also this afternoon, my colleague Christine Bush, AARCH's Preservation Services Director, is in the webinar, and as with all things at AARCH, this afternoon's event was a team effort. As I said, today we're highlighting how Adirondack North Country communities can use these important financial incentives like historic tax credits to create positive and sustainable economic development. We're going to have a cute question and answer period after the presentations where our experts will address audience questions and comments.
So I'm Beth Cumming. I am the coordinator for the technical review staff at the State Historic Preservation Office. My particular responsibilities include the reviewing of parts 2 and 3 of the commercial and rehabilitation tax credit program. We're going to talk primarily today about the commercial program, and we'll end with a little bit of information from William and my group about the homeowner program, just to make sure you guys know about everything there is to get from our office. All right, so William and I are representatives of the New York State Office of Historic Preservation located at Peebles Island State Park in Waterford. Our office is part of the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. We are the stewards of natural, historic, and cultural resources, and also provide safe and enjoyable environment, recreational, and educational opportunities for all visitors. Specifically, our office is the State Historic Preservation Office, and many of you probably know us as the SHPO. We identify, recognize, preserve, and protect cultural resources throughout New York State. So today we're going to talk about the tax credit incentive programs available for identified historic properties. First, the state and federal tax credits that are available for income producing properties, and then a bit about the tax credit specifically for owner occupied properties. So let's start with what I think we are all here for today, the specifics of the commercial or income producing properties programs. So we administer 2 programs. One is the tax credit, is a tax credit on your federal taxes, and one is a tax credit on your state taxes. The federal program credit is equal to 20% of the value of the qualified rehabilitation expenses. For projects over $2.5 million, the state credit value is equal to the federal credit value, or an additional 20% of the qualified rehabilitation expenses, capped at a credit value of $5 million. If the project is under $2.5 million, the New York State program value is increased to 30% of the qualified rehabilitation expenses. With all this, the bottom line is the opportunity exists for the rehabilitation of commercial properties to receive tax credits valued at 40 to 50% of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures. So we're going to talk some more about that big mouthful here as we go through the remainder of the slides. In order to get the tax credit at the state level, you have to receive the federal one. So there's no application for the state credit. I'm going to begin talking about the specifics of the federal credit because you have to get that credit in order to qualify for the state credit. The federal credit is administered in cooperation with the National Park Service and the IRS. The attained credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the state and federal tax liability. Note, this is not a deduction, it is a dollar-for-dollar credit. In order to qualify for the program, the building being rehabilitated must be considered a historic building by the National Park Service. Their definitions include historic buildings that are listed individually on the National Register of Historic Places, buildings that contribute to listed National Register historic districts, and buildings located in a local historic district which has been certified by the National Park Service for the purposes of the tax credit program. Individual buildings and those historic districts which are eligible for the National Register may qualify for the program if they are in the process of becoming listed. Next, the federal program requires that the proposed project be considered a substantial rehabilitation. To meet this requirement, your project's qualified rehabilitation expenses over a chosen 24-month test period must be more than the adjusted basis of the property. The adjusted basis is calculated as the value of the property minus the value of the land, minus depreciation already taken, plus capital improvements. Most accountants can help you with this calculation. Please keep in mind that once this test is met, all qualified rehabilitation expenses for the project would be included in the credit calculation. There's a couple of additional requirements for the state tax credit program. First, as we've already noted, you must get the federal credit to get the state one. Additionally, the property must be located within a census tract which is eligible for the state tax credit. The applicant must also pay a small review fee for our office. And additionally, you should note that the state tax credit is capped at $5 million. There is no cap on the credit for the state program. All right, so to summarize the qualifications, you must have a certified historic building. The project must pass the substantial rehabilitation test. And for the state credit, the project must be located in an eligible census tract. Our office can help confirm the historic status of your building and census tract. Please contact our office early before work begins. All work during the project must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation in order to qualify for the credits. And we'll talk a bit more about these standards a bit later in this presentation. I'd like to talk a little bit about the paperwork. The application for the federal program has 3 parts and can be downloaded from the National Park Service's website. And the address is here, and we can send that out even after the presentation. There are 3 parts to the application. And to summarize, part 1 is confirmation that the building is historic and considered a certified historic structure. Part 2 is documentation of the existing conditions of the building and the description of the proposed work. Part 2 is likely the most detailed part of the application. Once the part 2 is approved, indicating the National Park Service agrees that the proposed work will meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, work should begin. Once the project is completed and the building is placed in service, the applicant should submit a part 3, indicating the work was completed according to the approved part 2. Generally, this is photographs. Okay, so as a reminder, what is a certified historic structure? Remember that they are buildings listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Those buildings in the listed historic district are those in the process of being listed. This information is generally what is provided in the part 1 of the application. Part 2 of the application is primarily a written narrative describing the existing conditions and the proposed work. This section requires submitting documentation, including prior to work photographs of all areas of the property, attic to basement, interior and exterior, even in areas where work is not proposed. Remember, this is a tax document and documentation is required. So please take it seriously, and with your cell phone at least, take more pictures than you think you'd ever need. Additionally, drawings that reflect current conditions and proposed work are needed. Historic photographs can also be helpful. So one more time on the paperwork. 2 copies of the Part 1, when ready, should be submitted to our office for our review. Once reviewed and deemed complete, our office will forward the application to the National Park Service with our recommendation, hopefully for approval. The Part 2 process is similar. 2 copies of the application are submitted to our office for review. Once reviewed and considered complete, our office will forward the application to the National Park Service with our recommendation, again, hopefully for approval. At that point, work should begin. Doing work prior to approval of the Part 2 is at the risk of the building owner and could risk denial of the final project. Once the project is complete, 2 copies of the Part 3 should be submitted to our office for review. Once reviewed and deemed complete, our office would forward the application to the National Park Service with our recommendation and hopefully approval. At this point, the project would be considered complete. All right, so that's the paperwork and the program requirements. Let's talk a bit about the proposed work. All the work on the building must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. In general, the standards ask that the project retain the building's character-defining features, repair these features if necessary, and if these features are deteriorated beyond repair, replace them in kind. Character-defining features or distinctive features often include the expected exterior facade, but also interior floor plans and windows. The National Park Service has very many resources to help applicants navigate the Secretary's standards. Please remember, I'm saying the standards for rehabilitation. This is not a restoration program, but instead is intended to help historic buildings retain their character-defining features and incorporate modern-day use requirements. Projects should retain their historic distinctive features. This includes methods of construction and examples of craftsmanship. Windows are considered character-defining features of historic buildings. They come in all shapes, sizes, and types. Please, please do not replace or remove your historic windows without consulting with our office. Windows are carefully considered under this program, and we can help. Energy efficiency is attainable under this program, but it should be carefully considered so as to not diminish the historic character of the building. Projects are usually able to meet code requirements and the Secretary's standards. We all want safe buildings, and we will work with you to come up with solutions to meet the requirements of both the Secretary of the Interior standards and local code officials. More keys to a successful project. It's important to identify the character-defining features with your project team. Work should be completed as approved, and amendments should be submitted if there are required project changes or unexpected conditions encountered during construction. Please keep the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation in mind as the project moves forward. And for large, complicated projects, hire an experienced team, an architect, preservation consultant, accountant, attorney, banker, etc., to help ensure good communication and successful completion. Once the project is complete, the Part 3 would be submitted. This is the request for certification of completed work. Generally, this is simply photographs of the completed work for our review and forwarding to the National Park Service. It should illustrate that the project was completed according to the approved Part 2. So sadly, there are some potential pitfalls. These are the most common pitfalls that we see. These include proceeding with work before the Part 2 is approved. If the work that is done prior to the National Park Service's approval does not meet the Secretary of the Interior standards in their opinion, your whole project would be denied. Please consult with us early. Also, not submitting an amendment for project changes may cause denial at the final Part 3 review. Amendments for project changes should be submitted to our office for review and forwarding to the National Park Service for their approval to ensure there are no surprises in the final submissions. Please don't assume that the National Park Service will agree with any local reviews or approvals by local boards for the purposes of the tax credit program. This program is an independent review, and the only body who can formally approve your application is the National Park Service. The leading causes of denials include the lack of sufficient pre-work documentation, completing work that doesn't meet the Secretary's standards, projects where the proposed use is incompatible with the historic building, and substantial interior demolition, which is not supported by the conditions or the documentation provided. Remember, this program covers the entire building from attic to basement, and all proposed work must be described. So our office will help you, and we want these projects to get the tax credit. We love historic buildings, and we'd like to have them back in service and people loving them and living in them once again. Here is a project on Staten Island. It's the Park Lane Apartments. It was once the nurse's residence at Seaview Hospital. And you can see it's in pretty sad condition at the beginning of the project. And at the end is in fantastic condition. Seniors are living there, and I think it looks great. Let's just go back and forth for a minute so you can kind of get the gist of the big change. You can see the dormers at the roof and all the vegetation. You can see the stucco has been restored. These are actually, the final product had the historic windows. They were in fantastic shape, despite the relatively sad condition of the building environment. So that, I like to end with a nice little case study like this to show the dramatic changes that can happen with this program. William is going to take over, and he's going to talk a little bit about the homeowner program and the barn tax credits.
Again, I'm William Floyd, Historic Preservation Technical Specialist for the New York SHPO office. I review compliance, commercial tax credit, and homeowner tax credit projects for the Adirondacks and the North Country. So I won't get as involved with the homeowner tax credit as Beth did with the commercial. But the tax credit program is a 20% tax credit towards your tax liability. And a couple of highlights: it's a much simpler program. It mirrors the commercial program in its layout, but it's simpler in the review process, as where the this SHPO office, excuse me, SHPO office approves it and certifies it. It does not go to the Park Service. So some of the basics: you have to be a New York State taxpayer. The property must be listed in the state and national registers of historic places. The property must be in an eligible census tract. And in the Adirondacks and the North Country, that except for a few areas, every home almost qualifies. And specific to the program, the project must exceed $5,000 in expenditures, qualified expenditures, 5,000 of which must be spent on the exterior of the home. And if the home income is less than $60,000, the credit is refundable for eligible incomes. So it's a refund and not a credit. Just a small little nuance there. And importantly, the work must be pre-approved by our office before beginning. And the photo here is a recent successful project where in Saranac Lake, where the homeowners needed a new roof. And it was an emergency fix, so they called us up and they applied the same day and had the roof replaced before this winter came. And they utilized our program to help them cover the costs. So some homes can have income producing units. These can be apartments or offices. etc. And these are a little bit different because you have to calculate the QREs, qualified rehabilitation expenditures. And so you can claim the full cost of the work done to your interior space of the unit in which you reside. And you can claim a portion of the exterior work. And this portion is a percentage of the square footage of your home that serves as your residence. And this is the same percentage that you claim on your New York State income taxes. And for the cost of the work for the income producing units, again, those do not qualify for this program. However, you can jointly utilize both the commercial and homeowner programs. And that way you can cover your homeowner expenses and your commercial expenses. These types of joint programs or joint applications are inherently more complex, so we always recommend that you hire a accountant if you don't have one, an architect, historic preservation consultant. And I use the word jointed as kind of a misnomer there. You're still applying separately for the commercial and for the homeowner, and those come into our office and are reviewed separately, but by the same reviewer, so that there is a lot of overlap there. And here is the paperwork flow. Again, it's very similar to the commercial, where there's a part 1 and part 2 and a part 3. The part 1 and part 2 are actually a combined document, but it sort of you apply the part 1 and part 2 to our office, and we confirm that it is a historic property. The part 2 explains what the proposed work is. We approve it, or we will give some conditions or recommendations to improve the application. And then once that is done, you have the go-ahead to start the work. And when the work is finished, you can submit the part 3 to our office, and we review it. And we will then issue, assuming it meets the standards, we'll issue a certification of completeness. And recently we have switched from a hard copy submission to a digital copy submission using DocuSign. And the white box on the right hand of the screen is from our website that has active links that take you right to DocuSign. What's important with the part 3, just to emphasize this again, is you need to submit the application, which is straightforward, very simple application, but that has to come with the total cost for each project and photographs of all the completed work, so that we can certify that the work was completed. So similar to the commercial program, there are some times where we do have to deny projects, mostly because the work does not meet the standards. And the image you see on the screen here is a before and after. The after is on the right-hand side, so they've removed the columns in their entirety with their beautiful capitals and installed porch railings and porch columns that are not compatible with the style of the home, and unfortunately permanently alter the look of the building. So this had been a project that was denied by our office. And this slide here is a before and after of a home that was flooded during Irene. In fact, this entire historic neighborhood was. And the homeowner here successfully used our program, historic homeowners program, to not only rehabilitate the building, but also elevate it slightly to mitigate any future flood risks. And I would be remiss if I did not just give one quick little plug-in for our historic barn tax credit. I know there was a recent presentation by my colleague Olivia for AARCH. But again, this is another vital way that we can restore a lot of our barns. I know there's a lot of barns in North Country. And just real quick, it does not have to be listed. The barn has to be constructed prior to 1946. Has to be a barn, so used for agricultural purposes. The project must exceed $5,000 in expenditure. You can't alter the historic appearance of the barn, and you can't convert it to a residence. That's another big one. And just to recap, we have a commercial income tax credit, and there's a potential of 20% federal tax credit with a successful project, and potential of 20 to 30% tax credit from the state for commercial projects. Homeowner tax credit, again, is a 20% state credit, and the barn tax credit is 20% as well. And here are the our office contacts for the Adirondacks in North Country. So there's for part 1 questions, those go to Dan Bagro and Aaron Sersnecki. Part 2 and 3 come to myself. And homeowner tax credit questions go to again Dan and Aaron. Part 3 questions come to me, and then my supervisor Beth, her contact is there as well.
Hello, everyone from Buffalo, where my partner Rich Rogers and I are awaiting 3 to 4 feet of snow for over the next couple days. So it's been nice knowing you all. We work together, and I'm going to let Rich introduce himself, but we work together in a number of different ways to pursue historic preservation and community development projects. As Aaron mentioned, I'm the president of Preservation Studios, which is a company that my dad Tom started 20 years ago, and that I joined in 2008. And as Aaron also mentioned, I've been practicing tax credit law since the mid-90s, starting in the affordable area. And for the last 15 years, I've been focused a lot on historic preservation. And my law partner is now Rich, as well as our associate, Zach Sabawa. And then I've done some real estate development, about $25 million worth of historic tax credit work, either in completed projects or a couple of projects that Rich and I have under construction now in Buffalo. So we sort of have attacked this from different ways. This is a visual of a before and after for my first project in the Hamlin Park neighborhood in Buffalo. So today I'm going to quickly just talk about the state of the tax credit market and the impact of the tax credits on our real estate market in particular. I normally would do a case study for a larger project that includes, 18 different kinds of financing, but we decided as a group to kind of focus on small projects here. So I'm going to do a case study on a small project that uses the 30% increased state tax credit that Beth and William mentioned. And then I'm quickly going to talk about some syndication basics, syndication being the way that we turn the commercial tax credit into money for construction. So this is a quick slide that really shows the impact of the tax credit program as an investment program and vehicle. It also, and this is important for places like North Country and in our area, Southern Erie County. It's a big job generator and a big construction job generator. These are well-paying, skilled jobs that in upstate New York, are career-oriented because of the amount of rehab that we do up here. But also the historic tax credit program is kind of an underappreciated affordable housing driver. And it pairs very well with other incentives. I know Amy's going to talk about a case study along those lines, and you'll get a better flavor for how that works. But especially places in the Adirondacks, I was certainly up there this summer and could see the pressure both in terms of short-term rentals that are taking affordable housing off the market, pandemic telecommuting where folks left New York City and never went back, but also just seasonal service employees. As you know, the North Country continues to be a big tourism destination. People have to drive farther and farther away to make their salads and stuff. So it's, you know, the historic preservation incentives can also be affordable housing incentives, and they're pretty effective when paired that way. So I'm not going to repeat too much of what Beth said, but New York did a really smart thing and increased its credit. It has a companion credit to the federal credit that's generally 20%, like the federal credit. But for smaller projects, it's been boosted up to 30%. And Rich and I are actually working on a few, maybe more, handful of projects that are taking advantage of that, including our own project in Buffalo that's under construction now. So it is a very real benefit, and it was a material legislative improvement to the program very recently, and it just started this year. So when I mentioned syndication, syndication is the way that we take tax credits out to the open market, and I'll use the word sell, but sell them to investors that can use them more efficiently than the developers can. These tend to be your regional banks and insurance companies. So in the eastern part of the state, this would be your Berkshire Bank, Five Star Bank. Rich syndicated a deal through Glens Falls National Bank. So these are smaller banks that have the mission to do this work, but also the federal and state tax shelter appetite. M&T Bank is another one. And you have your national banks and insurance companies. These are the big players. I saw that Keith Pettis from Chase's community development arm is on the session today. So this is going to be your Chase banks, your Bank of America's, U.S. banks. They tend to be involved in much larger projects. I shouldn't say that doesn't give you much context. Projects that are closer to 10 million and up than 10 million and down, but I can tell you that Keith's team is investing in our deal in Buffalo because it's an affordable deal, and they are doing it's less than, you know, we're offering well less than $2 million in federal credit, and they've been a great partner. Subchapter C corporations, these are your Sherwin-Williams paint companies. In the old days, your energy companies like Chevron. They are the ones that they've made it a program as a corporation to invest in these types of shelters, and they invest directly or through syndicators. Syndicated funds are funds. Syndicators don't like to be called brokers, but they are. And they put together funds, often filled with Fortune 500 companies that just don't want to be directly involved in real estate, but either programmatically or economically or from a tax perspective, the program makes sense. And so, you know, whereas a Chase Bank or a Berkshire Bank would be a direct investor into your project, these would be investors who are coming in through these investment funds. And then private placement is actually the case study we're going to use today. And these are when an owner investor, you know, develops a project and then keeps the tax credits within its own small ownership group. They tend to be very localized deals and much smaller, because of the restrictions on individuals claiming tax credits, which are many and a little bit past this scope. So we're going to talk about a small project today, and this is actually an imaginary project because Hall's Inn, while it was a real Adirondack resort, it was torn down about 10 years ago, I understand, or at least the main hotel was. This one's near and dear to my heart. I spent a few awkward tweener years here in the early 80s with my parents. And I really was my first introduction to Adirondack summer life, and with the fancy white tablecloths in the dining room. I promised my dad that I wouldn't tell the story about when he fell into Fourth Lake completely clothed to save his Nikon camera. Sorry, Dad, I think I just did that. But this was a classic resort. I'm sure William and Beth probably would look very hard at qualifying it for listing in the National Register. If it was still existing, it would be over 100 years old at this point and continuously operating. The historic tax credit program is an adaptive reuse program, but it also can be used to, you know, improve and continue existing uses, very much so in the hotel context. We see that from time to time, but also I've seen it in the manufacturing context and others. So we do change buildings with historic tax credits quite a bit, but we also from time to time just continue their use because they're they're all fully depreciated, and the program allows you to reinvent and to reinvigorate. So let's say that this building wasn't torn down, but it was pretty significantly disinvested. And, you know, we had a small investment group, and we were able to negotiate about $1 million purchase price for the project. Whenever you're approaching one of these projects, you don't have to have, you know, a 100 line item budget to determine on the back of a napkin where your credits might fall in terms of size. You can use these categories of cost: your acquisition cost, your hard costs, which is construction costs, labor and materials. Soft costs, these are things like architecture, insurance, and legal fees, things like that. And then the program does allow you to charge a developer fee to the project, but we don't generally do that with projects that are kind of self-owned, because you're really generally just paying yourself a taxable developer fee. So in the middle column shows what the project actually will cost. We're going to spend $1 million on buying it. We're going to spend $2 million to renovate it and bring it back to service. About 12% of that on top for all of the soft costs for design. And as I said, we're not going to throw a developer fee on there in this case. So we have about a $3 million project, a little bit less, or sorry, a little bit more. That said, the right-hand column is the column that shows you the costs that actually generate tax credits. So you want to buy low and spend higher, and because you don't earn any tax credits on your acquisition. You can see here that we passed Beth's substantial rehab test, because we're spending $2 million and over $2 million on the project, and our basis, our tax basis, according to our acquisition, was only $1 million minus the land cost. So we're well over that. So we will qualify using that test. I generally don't include all of the hard costs in QREs when I'm estimating, because there are certain costs that won't qualify. Generally, anything outside of the building envelope will not qualify for tax credit. So you could end up spending significant amounts on things like site or utilities that aren't part of your QREs. So we bring that down a bit. Same thing with the soft costs. The soft costs have to be construction related. So you will have costs that are not construction related. And so we chip those down a bit. So that gets us about a $2 million tax basis for the purposes of determining our tax credits. Federal credit is that 20% credit. It hasn't changed in decades, and hopefully won't for many more. But here, as I mentioned, we actually have a 30% state credit, because we're under that $2.5 million project size. And so we're actually generating about almost $200,000 more in New York credits. Setting aside tax implications of all of this, you're raising about the same amount of money that you invested to buy the property by the time you complete it. So you can see, as an owner operator, the tax credits on a pre-tax basis allow you to recoup your initial investment, and then you're able to use the operations and the income from the property to recoup the balance of it. This is about as simple as it gets when it comes to the rectangles. We have a property, I guess I could have called it Halls Inn, but we have a property that generates, that's owned in a limited liability company. It generated the tax credits, or sorry, the cost basis that we saw. We have two owners, let's say it's 50-50. The federal tax credit can be carried forward for 20 years or carried back 1 year, because the federal tax credit is not a refundable credit. You have to keep carrying it forward and applying it against your income until it's finally depleted or it expires. Your New York credit was made, quote, refundable not long, well, actually longer, over 5 or 7 years ago, maybe longer actually at this point. And that means that if you don't have enough New York State tax liability to sop all that credit up, that the Department of Tax will give you a refund check. I've gotten a couple of these, so I can attest that they do actually come. They just take forever, and you will have to undergo an audit. But you will survive the audit if you work with the right advisors, and you will get that check to help recoup your investment. So that's a simple way of sort of buying, developing, and ongoing ownership with a small ownership group. The tax credits flow according to your interests in the partnership, and it's pretty straightforward. I mean, from my perspective, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. Rich and I also do this thing where we help developers turn these tax credits into money, and that's where folks like Keith and others come into play and literally become partners in the transaction. And so here's a very simple syndication structure. So again, we have our 123 Main Street, and instead of it being 50-50, you'll notice that it's 99% and 1%. And that's because under tax law, the tax credits follow your ownership interest. And so if you're bringing a tax credit investor in whose sole purpose, well, primary purpose is to receive tax credits, you want to make sure they're receiving as many as possible. And so the maximum amount under the current law is 99%. That seems a little counterintuitive in that, you know, if you're a developer, this is your real estate project. Why is someone else own 99% of it? It's really an effective ownership interest for 5 years. The developer remains, as long as the developer develops and operates a good project, they will remain fully in control. And generally, the economics of the real estate are similar to what they would be if the tax credit investor wasn't involved, although there are some exceptions to that. But the tax credit investor is extremely passive, and you know, if you keep up with your periodic reporting requirements and the property performs properly, your tax credit investor really should be largely a silent partner. And they're also there to help you if you do get in trouble, because they are your partner. I mean, they're not going to bend over backwards to do things that are not wise financially or economically, but if the project does get in trouble, the tax credit investor is the first person to find out, and often will be there to help with a solution, or at least help you figure it out based on their experience. That said, this is the simplest syndication structure you're ever going to see. The world, meaning the industry, is trending a lot to, even for any deal size. It used to be only for larger projects, but we're now using something called a lease pass-through model. I'm not going to go through this on this call or on this meeting, but I will say that if you are talking to an investor that offers this structure, don't let its complexity scare you away, because it is a more beneficial structure for both developer and investor from an equeconomics and risk perspective. It just requires you to have really sharp advisors and to keep track of a few more rectangles. But the basic concept is that, you know, the landlord entity here owns the real estate, and the tax credit investor comes in through a tenant that is downstream through a lease, and the syndication happens at another level as opposed to all within the same rectangle like we saw in this example. It is more complex. It's generally used for larger transactions, but you get more bang for your buck that way. In my last couple of minutes here, I'll just quickly run through if you are going to reach out to a tax credit investor, and tax credit investor acquisition folks, these are folks who intake deals. They're very, very accessible, and the industry, you know, is very user friendly. You can contact them early on in your conceptual phase of the project, but the more due diligence you have ready, the more seriously your project will be taken by an investor. So I tend to use the rectangle on the left as a list of things that I generally will have either ready or have a reason for not having before I will touch base with an investor about a project. So you're going to want to make sure, first of all, you know, that your project qualifies. So if you don't have your part 1s and 2 approvals, you want to make sure that at least William and Beth have said that they're receptive to your application. You want to make sure you pass the substantial rehab test, because that's a waste of everyone's time. In large markets where people buy buildings for $10 million and maybe only invest $7 million, the substantial rehab test is a really big deal. And the Adirondacks, it's probably not going to be too tough to satisfy on most projects, because of the acquisition costs are far outweighed by the cost of construction. Site control is very important. If you don't control a piece of property, an investor is only going to take so much time until they, if they realize that someone else could actually buy the property. So it's important to have a contract or have a right to buy it so that you can assure whoever's investing time underwriting your deal can get the deal if they do the right, if they make the right offer. Environmental assessments are very important, especially if you're working with financial institutions like banks. Overly cautious about environmental risk, I'll suggest banks are these days. And so it helps to be able to say your project's either clean or it's not clean, but you have a plan to clean it up, or even better, you're heading into the brownfield cleanup program. You don't have to have mature drawings, architectural plans and drawings to approach an investor, but it sure helps to know at least how many units you're offering, for instance, or how many commercial square feet you're offering, since some investors don't get involved in certain types of real estate classes or certain sizes of projects. So you don't have to have everything fleshed out, but if you have a schematic, that helps a lot. Commercial pre-leasing will depend on how much commercial space you have in your project. Building permit comes at the very end of your pre-development process, but the sooner you have it, the better. Developer projections and your QRE estimates. These are your personal, you as a developer or your advisor's estimates of what an investor might expect to receive by way of financial benefit. These will be eventually confirmed by independent accountant projections, but they often you can go a long way with your own numbers if they're well presented. If you have an idea of your of your financing package, that's very helpful. Most tax credit investors don't make loans, so they need to know where your debt's coming from. And I don't think I've been involved in a project in upstate New York that did not have a property tax abatement. And so this is going to be a meeting one question for you as a developer as to what you are doing to abate the taxes when you take a $1 million asset and turn it into a $7 million asset, because most properties in upstate New York cannot afford to pay taxes based on full assessment, unfortunately. On the right-hand side, I'm not going to get into this too much, but when you do negotiate an investment, these are the sort of categories of things you're going to be negotiating. Everything from the value that the investor will infuse into the project. That's called, we call that pricing, but it's not really pricing. Things like project structuring. Are you going to go with the first model I showed or the second model? Who is going to guarantee the project? Like a loan, developers personally guarantee the delivery of historic tax credits to their investors. Very serious and significant obligation that is fraught with risk. And so whoever decides they're personally guaranteeing your particular transaction should be well advised of what those risks are, because they are far beyond what a normal construction lender would require. I'm going to stop there and introduce my partner and both in law and real estate, Rich Rogers, who is going to talk about ways to raise funds outside of the historic tax credit delivery. And this is actually is really cutting edge stuff, and I learn every time I listen to him. So enjoy. Go ahead, Rich.
As Jason mentioned, I'm a practicing attorney with Yots Law Firm, but I am also a co-founder of Homeowner. Homeowner is an investment crowdfunding platform that is registered with the SEC and FINRA for small businesses and real estate development companies to raise capital, right, by selling securities. I'm going to move relatively quickly through this because I want to make sure that folks have time for questions today. But my email address is right here. It'll be on the last slide as well. Please feel free to contact me with any questions because I think there's going to be a lot of information. So just a really brief agenda. Going to talk a little bit about challenges in raising capital that folks encounter. Going to do a brief summary of historic tax credits, and everyone's talked about that a little bit. And then, some challenges in monetizing historic tax credits, particularly for small projects, right? I think that's really kind of the focus here. A brief introduction to what investment crowdfunding is, and then how it could be applicable to historic tax credit projects, and then very briefly, a real world example. So, I think anyone can drive around any communities in New York State, whether they're up in the Adirondacks or otherwise, and see, kind of a lot of vacant buildings, and kind of generally, right, that's a market failure. Folks have been unable to raise capital to properly maintain or redevelop those buildings, right? Raising capital is very challenging if you kind of don't come out of a world where it's normalized, and so there's a lot of rules and regulations around it. And so typically and traditionally, right, you're not really able to raise capital unless you have a lot of assets to begin with to help secure capital. So many small businesses are started by folks taking a second mortgage on their house, right? But if you don't have that wealth to begin with, it can be very difficult to get liquidity to start your business, right? Traditionally, up until a few years ago, if you wanted to raise capital from third parties, they had to be high net worth individuals. And you had to have a personal relationship with them. So, if you're not, a member of the country club, let's say, it could be really difficult to, find ways to tap in and raise capital, and not to mention just expensive to prepare the documentation and find a securities attorney to do it correctly. Many of you are likely familiar with kind of the ugly history in this country of redlining and excluding a lot of minorities and folks living in poor neighborhoods from accessing capital. It's not a new story, but it's something that is kind of continuing to this day at some level. So that's kind of globally some of the challenges with raising capital. And then I want to talk about tax credits and some challenges around tax credits before talking about solutions. So as multiple folks have mentioned today, the federal and New York State tax credit are really designed to fill the gap, to help kind of come in and make projects work that wouldn't otherwise, right? The additional costs of rehabbing a building. As Jason mentioned, the New York State tax credit is refundable, meaning the New York State will write you a check if you don't have tax liability at the New York State level to shield. And even after syndicating, you might get 20 to 35% of your total project costs kind of through this through the historic tax credit process. Jason talked about this somewhat extensively, but the process of syndication is essentially bringing in a third-party investor in order to monetize your tax credits. That investor will make capital contributions, they will receive some cash flow, they will receive distributions of the tax credits, or allocations, I should say. After that, after the 5-year recapture period, typically the historic tax credit investor kind of goes away, is bought out, and then you go back to owning the building. Again, I think this is kind of redundant from the last presentation, but I think you can see here, and I think what's important is that there's a gap, right, during construction. When you go through this process of syndicating tax credits, a lot of that cash is going to come in on the back end. So during construction, you need to figure out how are you paying to get the project built before that tax credit investor puts their cash in. And that might be through a bridge loan, that might be through additional cash or equity on hand. There's various approaches, but even on a smaller project, that is something to think through. So some challenges with raising capital. This is, I think, amplified for small projects, but this is the case kind of across the board for folks who are trying to syndicate tax credits. Typically, if you don't have $1 million in federal credits, maybe 800,000 would be the absolute floor. It's very difficult to find a tax credit investor. The fees that are associated with tax credit transactions can be really scary and get really big really fast. In some cases, they're exceeding $100,000 between the investor's attorney, accountants, etc., all of which the project is expected to pay for. A lot of investors have very specific return requirements. As I mentioned, most of their capital won't come in until the end. There's very specific and complicated and expensive insurance requirements, both for liability, hazard insurance, and title insurance. As Jason mentioned, you have a lot of reporting obligations, typically quarterly, sometimes monthly, to your tax credit investor. There's some limitations on a bank being able to foreclose. This kind of limits what investor or which lenders you can work with in some cases. You have to guarantee, as Jason mentioned, some of these obligations back to the tax credit investor. And then you're going to need to get, certain levels of financials, which will add additional cost. So I know that was a lot of downsides that sound really scary, and I definitely don't want to discourage anyone from pursuing the program or looking into it. But I do think that these are things to be aware of and mindful of. If you're considering syndicating your tax credits, there are a lot of challenges, that the traditional syndication investment model kind of brings with it, right? And you should really kind of think carefully about these obligations and costs. Investment crowdfunding. So investment crowdfunding is a new tool that was authorized by the Jobs Act, which was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Obama. It has been around for a few years now. I think 2016, they passed the final regulations. And essentially what investment crowdfunding allows folks to do is sell securities using the internet in their project. And when I say securities, that means you're selling an investment opportunity to investors. And what was really revolutionary about it is you don't have to have a pre-existing business relationship with these folks, right? So I kind of mentioned the country club example. You can now have folks who don't know, who could be anywhere in the country, right? And they don't necessarily need to be a high net worth individual, right? And so that, I think, brings folks in who might be from Saranac Lake or Lake Placid or Tupper Lake up there, and might be living elsewhere but want to invest in their hometown, right? You get access to investors who might be motivated by things other than kind of bottom line returns. It also gives folks within the community an opportunity to invest in these projects that are nearby, or these restaurants or breweries or other businesses that wasn't really allowed just a few years ago. And so, why is this so exciting, right? It gives business owners kind of control over the investment terms. Right. So, you can kind of dictate things like pricing and management and control rights, and, kind of get the community involved. So I just kind of touched on some of this, right? There are some limitations, but what's kind of important to know is that accredited investors, high net worth individuals can still invest in these offerings, and they can invest unlimited amounts, right? And kind of crucially, right, I think when folks think of crowdfunding, they think of things like Kickstarter or GoFundMe, where folks are really donating and getting some sort of, like a prize or something in return. This isn't that, right? Folks are actually buying stock or lending money to these companies. It does come with some compliance requirements, right? You need to file a document with the SEC, and you need to work with their broker dealer or funding portal to conduct this type of offering. You also, have certain financial reporting and disclosure requirements. Recently the SEC has actually opened this up a bit more, right? So previously this was for very, very small businesses. Now folks can raise up to $5 million per year using regulation crowdfunding. And, they can also kind of do a test offering to gauge interest, make sure it's kind of a good idea with the terms that they're proposing and that there's still interest there. And lastly, they can use a special purpose crowdfunding vehicle, which is something that we see being beneficial for a lot of real estate offerings, whether they're using tax credits or not. And so a funding portal, which is the intermediary, right? So Homeowner, our company, is a funding portal. There's a bunch of other funding portals, WeFunder, Small Change. And the funding portal is essentially where you're going to list your offering, right? So there's going to be a page where folks can invest, right? You're going to put all of your disclosure documents up there. You're going to talk about what you're going to do with the investor funds. And you're going to talk about your project, and you might have a video, you might have a pitch deck, stuff like that. And the funding portal, will help with that. What the funding portal can't do is really show favoritism to your offering over other offerings on the platform. It's not making any guarantees, and it's not an attorney or an accountant or anything like that, right? It's really facilitating your offering for you to go out there and raise capital from a bunch of different investors. Regulation crowdfunding is growing pretty dramatically, right? So, over the past several years, it's kind of one of, I think the graph is obviously kind of a fake graph, but it has been that type of pretty rapid growth as folks become more familiar with it being out there, and just really the flexibility, right? So you can issue debt securities, right? If you need a bridge loan before your tax credits come in, if you need an acquisition loan to acquire a property, right? Or you could sell stock, right? There's just a lot of different ways that this can be used and structured for real estate developers, but also small businesses. And so, the last thing I want to talk about is crowdfunding for tax credit projects, right? With it being flexible and being able to, kind of dictate the terms a bit, you can, really kind of get the types of terms that work for your project. And really kind of crucially, right, many projects in the Adirondacks and all over New York State, right, and a lot of the projects I think we would all like to see get done are not $10 million projects. They're not even $5 million projects. There's a lot of $2 to $3 million projects that are only going to throw off $500,000 worth of tax credits, and that traditional syndication model is not going to work. And particularly for a nonprofit who has no use for the tax credits whatsoever, this would allow them to at least get some investment in their deal, allow them to monetize the tax credits to some extent, right? Where they would otherwise just go to waste. So, here, this just kind of compares, some of the typical deal metrics that you might see from an investor if you were able to get one versus what you might be able to do with regulation crowdfunding. But much of the savings are in fees and things of that nature. But, there's certain deal terms, but I think really the crucial thing is getting the money up front, right? So now you're not drawing on an expensive bridge loan or expensive construction loan. You could get the money initially to start to build the project as soon as you complete your offering. There are some challenges with regulation crowdfunding that, you know, I want to be very transparent, not gloss over, right? Particularly for historic tax credits. So as Jason mentioned, you know, these large C corporations are best positioned to take advantage of the tax credits and use them. They're most likely to have what's called, you know, passive income to use the credits against, or, you know, have certain exceptions that they can rely on. A lot of individuals don't. So many individuals might not be able to use the federal historic tax credit. They could still use the New York State tax credit, however. So that's something to be mindful of. The offering could fail. You might not find enough investors who are willing to do it. And, you know, a large, you know, bank or financial institution, you don't really run that risk, right? So that's kind of an important thing to bear in mind. You know, the historic tax credits might be a bit complicated for many investors. You're probably going to have to do a lot of work explaining it, connecting them with accountants to explain it. And you do need to work with a broker-dealer funding portal who's going to charge some fees, and you're going to have some additional compliance requirements doing so. However, as I just mentioned, right, you're going to get that cash up front as opposed to kind of bridging it. That can save you a lot of money. Very significant amount, actually. You can kind of control the terms of the offering and make sure it's something that works for your deal. You can really reduce your fees, right? So as I mentioned, you can easily run up well over $100,000 in fees for the investor to kind of meet their requirements. You know, in this case, by disclosing a lot of the risks, instead of kind of getting a very expensive attorney involved, you can kind of forego some of those fees. And I kind of talked about the nonprofits already. So very quickly, want to go through an example scenario, not on Common Owner, although we will have some tax credit offerings in the very near future. This is a project that we worked with, our law firm worked with, who did what's called an intrastate offering, which is kind of similar to investment crowdfunding, except at the federal level, you work with the New York State Attorney General's office instead of the SEC to kind of go through your offering prospectus, but a relatively similar process where you're looking for small, individuals and other small investors to come into the structure and utilize the tax credits. So this is a project called Arts Cafe Springville in Springville, New York. When they acquired the property, it looked like this, right? So I really love this photo. It really kind of goes to show that if you're, dedicated enough to making something happen, very few buildings are beyond saving altogether. I think our client Seth said that the roof was literally in the basement when they took title to it. Over time, obviously, they were able to rehab it. Springville Center for the Arts is a nonprofit, and so they were able to acquire Arts Cafe, this building, which they named Arts Cafe Springville, right? And so they put together their prospectus, filed it with the Attorney General's office, and began, essentially knocking on doors, right? They had a website, they had a social media presence, they had an email list, it was a lot of work. The executive director, Seth Wojcinski, really did a really stellar job of this, and connecting local businesses and business owners and individual investors with accountants to kind of walk them through a lot of the challenges and questions that they had. And they just did a phenomenal job of it. But, it goes to show that it is possible to bring in a lot of folks. I think that they were investing, 90 cents on the dollar in the credits, on the federal credits. So not a whole ton of upside necessarily for them. They do get some cash flow. But, I think the pitch for Seth was, even if you're not making a lot of money, spend your tax dollars locally instead of sending them to Washington. And that seemed to resonate with a lot of folks in Springville. So yeah, it's up and running. I was actually there a couple of weeks ago, and they were able to combine the tax credit equity with other state grant sources, which they then loaned into the project. So things like the Green Innovation Grant Program, they had a green roof. I think they may have had other EPF funding and funding from ESD. So definitely not an easy capital stack, but it does kind of provide a framework for what can be done. So again, here's my contact information, our website. Feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call. I've also listed the website for Springville Center for the Arts, and also Reimagine Fund, who's a group down in Louisiana that we're working with, who really help sponsors, project sponsors understand the tax credits. They have a lot of educational materials for potential, small investors in tax credit deals. And so, if you're looking to learn more, they would be great folks to speak with. And obviously we'd be happy to talk with you on the common owner side as well. So I will turn it over to Amy, who will be sharing a case study from Saranac Lake, correct?
That's right. Super. Thank you so much, Rich. That was super cool. Makes me want to do another project just to follow your model, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So I'm Amy Catania. I'm Executive Director of Historic Saranac Lake. Thank you so much to Aaron and AARCH for hosting this program, supported by Adirondack Foundation. We love them here in the Adirondacks. So I'm really excited to share a little bit about our project to rehabilitate the Trudeau building for expansion of our museum. I want to talk kind of quickly because I want to give people plenty of time for questions and answers. So this is where I get to work every day. This is the Saranac Laboratory Museum in downtown Saranac Lake. Historic Saranac Lake is an architectural preservation organization that was founded in 1980. And we acquired this building in the early 2000s and opened it as a museum in 2010. So our mission has expanded over the years, but we still keep our foot in architectural preservation. We do a lot of work with National Register, talking to folks in Saranac Lake here about the tax credit. So, for us, that's still a big part of our mission. And when the neighboring building, the Trudeau building, came on the market, let me show you a picture of that. That came on the market in 2019. It was rumored that it might have been, somebody was interested in demolishing it to put up a CVS. We just couldn't let that happen. This building used to, for many years, was on the same deed as our property next door. So this was built in 1894, the same year as the laboratory, by Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau. This was his home and his medical office, and then he walked next door to do laboratory research on tuberculosis. So a really important building in downtown Saranac Lake. It was really, for us, a natural place to expand our museum. We're short on space. We're short on exhibit space, collection space. So for us, it just really made a lot of sense to grow into this building. We also recognized that it was an incredible challenge for us. We needed to pay for the building. It wasn't cheap. And then it had a whole lot of work to do. So this is unfortunately not what it looks like today. This is what it looks like today. So unfortunately, the building is not the beautiful red that it used to be. It's covered in blue vinyl siding. It's been a medical office for over 100 years. Lots of changes, unfortunate changes on the inside and the outside, and a lot of work to be done. So we bought the building, and then COVID hit. And in an odd way, it really gave us some time to do a lot of the work that there are a lot of pieces to be able, I think, for us anyway, to really be able to make use of the tax credits. And so during the last 2 years, we really pulled all those pieces together and made it possible to use the credits. So what I want to show you today is just a kind of quick overview of what I see as sort of the main pieces of the puzzle for for us anyway, for using the tax credits. The first piece for us is obviously you really need the documentation and you need the building to be on the National Register. Luckily for us, we had done that work already. We have worked since our founding to list over 200 properties in the village on the National Register, and the Trudeau building is part of, and our building, the laboratory, is part of the Church Street Historic District. So having that documentation, having the documentation of the history and the architecture of the building itself, and the listing on the National Register was an important first step. Then we really needed to acquire the building and do some of the planning. And I think I probably underestimated early on the degree of planning needed. Levels of planning, looking at code, looking at, the village permitted uses of the building, the architectural design that just kind of goes on forever. This was, I think it's easy to underestimate when you're not in that world, how important that part is and how much time and money it takes to do it right. So we luckily partnered early on with an architectural preservation firm, with Landmark Consulting in Albany, Kim and Jack Alvarez. They've been really great. Really just, from the beginning, planning appropriately for the building's preservation and rehabilitation. So that was super important. Fundraising was also important. I think for us, it was really important to have some early success with fundraising to start to be able to develop interest in investors in the tax credits. We had a lot of luck early on with fundraising. I was quite surprised, actually. So before we even thought about the tax credits, we were able to raise about $2.2 million. That was really had a lot to do with having a membership base, having a well-established sort of community of people who care about what we do. Being able to successfully go for some early grants, state grants. So an EPF grant was a huge help with acquiring the building and doing some of the planning and construction to come. Also Downtown Revitalization Initiative grant, and then getting those grants to leverage more support with donors. So we were able to raise that amount of money early on, which was great, but we realized that we needed more than that. And I don't think you have to raise this much money to be able to be successful with the tax credits, but we recognized that our project budget was going to be high enough that the tax credits were going to be a real help to us. Fundraising too was really about not just talking about why we wanted to save the building, not just talking about saving the building in and of itself, but why it matters to us and our mission, and why it matters to the community. So being able to articulate the fact that the building was going to allow us to tell a broader story, to involve stories that bring in stories into the museum that we hadn't told before, really being able to articulate that purpose was really important for us for fundraising. A fourth piece that was super important and is ongoing is educating the staff, ourselves, the board, about the tax credits and how they work. So we were lucky that as an architectural preservation organization, we have some prior experience with that. We've been tuning in to trainings like this over the years that have really helped us understand, but it is a complicated thing. Even just listening to this today, I'm like, what are they talking about? I kind of forget some of the complexity of all of this. So it's important to educate yourself and do it in any way you can. Accessing the trainings from the Preservation League, Adirondack Architectural Heritage, the State Historic Preservation Office, all of those things have been really helpful for us. Here is a chart. Well, for example, I actually watched a presentation that Jason Yots made a couple of years ago when we were first starting to think about this. And I was like, I need to do some math to figure out how this is going to work for us. And I literally printed out the slides. Sorry, Jason. And did the math of our project on those slides. And those are some of the same slides you shared today. So tip for anybody out there, go back to the presentation and look at what Jason showed you, because it's super helpful. And the checklist that you provided, Jason, of things that you need to have done was really important for sort of guiding us along the way. So doing that early math, sort of starting to talk to the board about it, is important, because at some point our board saw a chart that looks like this. And I know it's too much to look at on your screen, but there are some complicated things that your organization needs to be willing to do if you're going to do the tax credits the way we did them. And if you don't have a board that's trusting of the director, that is understanding and interested in doing the work to understand how the tax credits work, you could have a board member who just shuts it down and says, you know what, this is risky, or this is something we don't want to get involved in. So that education was really important. For us, then, it was important to find a consultant. Consultants aren't cheap, but they are able to get you the rest of the way with the tax credits, and you really can't do it by yourself. I recognize that at some point that if we were going to bring in an investor, we needed somebody to work with us to make sure that we were checking the boxes early on, that we were, that the project was viable, and they were going to help us articulate our project to an investor. So we worked with Wishneff and Associates. They're in Virginia, but they work nationally on tax credit projects. They've been great to work with, and I totally recommend Jason at Preservation Studios. Work with someone in New York if you can. We're New Yorkers. That's awesome. And and totally common owner. If I could go back and do it again, I think I would spend more time looking at that model and seeing how that could work for us. So, there are good consultants out there, and it's important, though, I think, that you show that your project is viable, because the consultants, at least the way we're working with ours, they don't get paid until the tax credits come in. And so they're not going to really want to spend their time on you if they don't see that you're a viable project. So doing some of these other pieces that I showed you is really important. And then when you have those things together, it's time to seek an investor. And this was, for me, like both the fun part and the really challenging part. I was, as a person who runs a museum, I don't talk a whole lot to mostly men in suits who work in Boston and New York, but I got to do that. And that was kind of an interesting experience. For this part of it, you really need to get ready to knock on doors, talk to individuals, businesses, corporations, big and small, banks. Think about pools of investors, make lots and lots of phone calls, and have a lot of conversations. And I did all of that, and not a single one of it worked out at first. But that's okay. Like, each one of those conversations helps you to understand your project better, hone the message, understand the project from the vantage point of the investor. So you're not just talking about how it's going to benefit you as an organization, but how it can benefit the investor. What we found ourselves looking for was a friendly investor. So the tax credits aren't a real great investment for your average person who has extra cash on hand and is looking to make money on that cash. The investment, the return on the investment comes in over a period of 5 years, and so. And I could be articulating this not totally perfectly, you guys, but so correct me if I'm wrong. But some of the people that I spoke to, many of them were major donors, but hesitant to invest their funds in something that wasn't going to provide the kind of return that they could get in other ways of investing. And so we really needed a friendly investor who saw that they were going to make a little bit of money on it, but that it was really something that was going to benefit us as well. And so we had a zillion conversations with a zillion people, each one of those things helpful. And I really started thinking about a pool of investors. And we developed a number of materials. This is also really important. So presentations. This is just one of the slides from one of the presentations. We had meetings with major donors of ours, with our consultant to answer questions. We actually developed this flyer too, and I'd be happy to share this as an example if anybody's interested. There isn't anything sort of ready-made out there. And so I went and developed like a one-page flyer that just kind of spells out the basics of the program. You always, always, always put something on that flyer very clearly that says we do not provide legal, tax, or accounting advice. So you want to make that disclaimer clear, but having something that just helps you hone your message and helps the investor understand what you're talking about. And a consultant can help with that as well. So all of that, it took a while, and it was really at some point where I came back and talked to one investor again, and then it all came together. And so that process, takes a lot of time, and it takes building trust. It takes the investor seeing that your project is actually viable, and get them getting excited with it. So I literally drove to this person's office out of ways from here and sat down with them and got our consultant on the phone and talked it through. And the person said, "I want to do this with you." And I cried and hugged the person, and it's pretty exciting when it works out. I think the pool of investor idea is really great. This way for us was really awesome because it came together very quickly then, and we were able to prepare the paperwork and really get everything solidified even before we're going into construction soon. So that's a nice way to go if you can do it. I'm not a member of a country club, but I would just encourage people who run nonprofits to not underestimate the possibilities of people who care about your mission and know what you do. And not all of them seem like people who would necessarily make this kind of investment, but some of them are able to. So don't underestimate your friends. We secured our investor, and we were able then to go out and change our fundraising sign, and it looks a whole lot fancier now. The museum sign, the thermometer went way up thanks to the tax credits. We increased our goal because we realized we needed to do more, and we had more money coming in to make that possible. And getting the tax credits actually allowed us to leverage more money with funders, private donors, and with other grant sources. So as the tax credits were becoming a reality, we were able to secure a New York Main Street grant, an NBRC grant recently, a federal grant, the Northeast Heritage Economic Program grant through the Preservation League. So more funding has come in, which has been really great. Even once you get the tax credits kind of figured out, there's always more design work to do, more approvals to get. All of that takes time, and it takes sort of learning new languages, but it's doable. And having, this is Kim and Jack from Landmark Consulting, having them on the team has made all the difference in the world. So that's all the puzzle pieces. Let me just quickly review what they are. Documentation, and I have this thing in my way so I can't see, but documentation and National Register, acquisition and planning, fundraising and educating your board and your staff, finding a consultant, seeking an investor, securing the investor, finishing designing, get approvals. And the final puzzle piece is waiting for us. We hope it will start in January. So we're waiting for, we have part 2 approval on the tax credits. We still have a little bit more approvals to get, but we hope to go out to bid for construction in January. And so that's the last piece of the puzzle, which is getting the project done. We will get, with the tax credits, we will get, when we go out, once we have the construction numbers and we can show that we have all the financing in place, which in our case, actually, we also got 2 lines of credit from 2 different banks, totaling $500,000. So that was our way of bridging some of the reimbursements issue. But we'll be able to show that we will receive, once we go out, once we have the construction numbers, we'll receive $315,000 in tax credit financing at the beginning of the project, around $450,000 when the construction's complete, and the final bit of money at the end after we get part 3 approval. So I'm going to stop talking, but I welcome anybody to reach out to me. I'm sure my contact information is up there somewhere, and I'm happy to answer questions and share materials and help in any way I can. So thank you.
Thank you all so very much. I'm delighted because it was great to hear everything that you all are doing, and Amy, that case study is terrific, because I think there's so many, we get so many questions of how can we make this happen? It feels big and overwhelming, because it is, but that was just fabulous. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or chat, but I have a couple of questions. Can you include attorney and accountant fees in a soft cost QRE? Which I think is a question for Jason, but probably Richard too.
Yes, if they are construction related. So if your attorney helps you buy the property, you can't include that fee. But if your attorney helps you do the construction loan and the development process, all of those legal fees and the title insurance attending that are includable. Yeah.
Great. And in terms of the New York State tax credit, I had a question. I think I know the answer to this, but I wanted to clarify. Because the state tax credit is refundable, do you need to be a New York State resident with state income tax liability to get that credit refunded to you?
Good question, Rich. You want to answer it?
Yeah, no, you don't. But one thing to be mindful of is that if you're taking that refund rather than utilizing that credit against tax, that refund can be then taxable as income at the federal level.
Okay, so I'm going to just, so you could be, for example, a Massachusetts resident or a Philadelphia resident, but you could take the New York State tax credit as a refundable, as a refund, but then that's going to be reported as federal income and taxable on your federal taxes.
Correct.
Excellent.
The refundability was brought in part to increase out of state investment, because there were, if at the time, if you had to be a New York State taxpayer, not a lot of corporations are home here anymore because of our higher corporate tax rate. So they wanted to attract out of state investment by making it refundable if you didn't do business here.
Excellent. And I think that was in 2011 that went through, 2011 or 20.
That long ago? Wow.
Amazing. I had a question about the crowdfunding, and you had mentioned, Rich, passive income, and I wasn't quite clear on that. Do you have to have passive income in order to invest in crowdfunding, or could you have,
No.
Is that just a more convenient vehicle?
No, so the passive income has to do with the credits more than the crowdfunding, right? And so, the crowdfunding, you're purchasing equity interests or you're loaning money, right? But the passive activity restrictions are what make it difficult for individuals to use tax credits in general, federal tax credits, right? So if you're a really wealthy doctor, let's say, and you have a lot of active income, maybe you're a surgeon and you make, $400,000 a year, you might think, oh, tax credits would be great, except that the passive activity restrictions would prevent you from using those federal credits against your active income as a surgeon. Now, if you're a surgeon and you make a bunch of passive investments in stocks and you have stock dividends and real estate income that's not shielded, right? You can use the tax credits against those sources of income. So it's just, it can be a little tricky, kind of navigating that process, right, for folks. So yeah, that's what the passive income thing is. There are some exceptions to that for certain real estate professionals, and there are some other exceptions. But in general, that's why it's hard for folks in many cases to use tax credits.
Kind of reiterate that historic district designation, National Register Historic Districts are the best way to access these credits. And that's something that's a great thing for communities to be doing proactively. Even if you don't have somebody who's planning on making an investment right away, if you have a downtown that could qualify, that's a wonderful way to kind of help investment, because I can say, for example, this was back when I was at the Preservation League of New York State, and I'm sure this was the case in the Adirondacks. There are communities, for example, along the Mohawk River in Montgomery County, where every village, saw a historic district designation because they saw it as economic development for their community. And I think that's the same case. Historic Saranac Lake has done a fantastic job of that in Saranac Lake. And that's the same with Malone. Our work with the nomination of Malone is the Malone Revitalization Foundation. And again, seeing, and this is the theme of preservation is economic development, but seeing the economic development potential getting that National Register designation off the bat, which makes the whole part one piece of this equation a lot easier.
The other thing that happens, I think, with the National Register is it really builds, community support for history and preservation. And that, ultimately it might take 20 years, but it can be a really slow process, but it can build that base of support that can make preservation happen years and years later. So, for us, we had our next door neighbors, the Hotel Saranac, came back, and that was a tax credit project. If that hadn't happened, I don't think we would have seen the Trudeau building as something doable for us. It would have been in the shadow of this vacant, enormous hotel. But the hotel came back, that made the Trudeau building look doable for us. And now the Trudeau Sanatorium property is getting rehabilitated. All of those things were, National Register listed projects. So it builds on itself too. And that's really exciting. And I think, 20 years ago, people in Saranac Lake wouldn't have said that. I think most people would have said, oh, what's the point of this? It's not really doing anything. And then suddenly you get some momentum, and suddenly, it really is making a huge difference. So New York Main Street grants down in the downtown district in small ways are helping with facade improvements. I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening that really do make a difference.
There's a question here about, is there a minimum amount that an investor would have to spend in a crowdfunded investment?
So for crowdfunding, the minimums are up to the issuer, right? And so the company that's raising the money, so if that's the development, project sponsor, right, they can set what the minimum is. And so in some cases it's as low as, $200. In some cases it's $2,000. It just, depends on the issuer and what they're kind of trying to do and how many investors they want to, manage.
We have a question whether AARCH helps individuals navigate through this process. We certainly help with National Register nominations. And in terms of helping navigate through the historic tax credit process, we don't act as consultants for the historic tax credit, but we are absolutely available for technical assistance and then connecting people. So if you have a question, if you'd like a list of preservation architects, a list of consultants who could walk you through the tax credit process, attorneys who are familiar with these kinds of projects, we can be that connection and facilitator. We don't act as historic tax credit consultants ourselves, but we are always very happy to help. Again, do what we can to facilitate the project. And I will also say, for anyone on here who is thinking about historic districts, I believe colleagues from the Preservation League were on this webinar, but they have a grant program that's a partnership with the New York State Council on the Arts that can help support cultural resource surveys, which is research and documentation towards a National Register historic district. So if you are from a municipality or part of a nonprofit like Amy's that wants to, or AARCH that wants to sponsor historic district nominations, that is a source of funding. And there are other sources of funding out there as well, but that Preservation League, New York State Council on the Arts funding is very, very important for a lot of these historic districts and how many of them get done. We can help connect you with that too. Can the village itself use this is a question about municipal use of the historic tax credits.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. The village would likely need to move the property into a local development corporation, which would then probably move it into a limited liability company. So kind of indirectly, we have seen municipalities use the program though. The city of Buffalo, owned the Northland Workforce Training Center, got that into the Buffalo Urban Development Corp, and then into an LLC to do a large historic and new market tax credit combined project. So it's not to say it's impossible, but yeah, there's a lot of complexity that goes into nonprofits using, the credits, and then kind of another level with a municipality.
And then we have another question about whether a group of properties can be bought under one umbrella to apply for the historic tax credit.
The answer is yes. You can do multiple properties. The complications that you have are if the properties are not related to each other, you literally are doing separate tax credit applications for each property. But you can do that. We have combined scattered side. I mean, we've done deals in Buffalo where the Diocese of Buffalo was divesting schools, and we took 3 schools in very different parts of the city and put them under one syndication. It is possible. It's complicated. It creates, exponential real estate risk for investors, so they tend to not be thrilled about the idea. But legally and from a partnership tax perspective, it is possible. Rich, I'm sure you have some warnings to add.
I think one thing to be mindful of, if you are going to pool various projects under one umbrella, is the timing of the projects. Investors tend to be very sensitive to timing, since the credits are specific to the year, the tax year, right? So some investors may have, a lot of tax liability in one year and not another, right? Particularly in New York tax liability. So if you have, 6 buildings and, 4 of them are going to be done in 23 and then 1 in 24, that just adds complication, right? Because then you have the 5-year kind of holding period. So now that's slipping another year, and, before you're going to get your investor out. So yeah, I think timing considerations, and then, as Jason mentioned, real estate and title risk are something you're going to have to get your investor very comfortable with.
Just say it is possible, but it's not easy. Land banks are a great source of historic properties. Newburgh is probably a prime example, but we see them all over the state. There's a couple dozen of them that are getting involved. And actually, Rich recently met with one here in Buffalo about trying to use the New Market Tax Credit Program to reuse properties. So I think forward-thinking municipalities with land banks are going to be intersecting with preservation pretty soon and closely.
Yes, and I think here in the Adirondacks, where Clinton County is looking into a land bank, I think Franklin County might be looking into a land bank. Not sure about Essex County, but it's definitely a positive momentum in understanding their power and possibility. I want to thank Christine Bush and Nolan Kuhl, our Educational Programs Director, is here as well. And then Samantha Johnson, our Administrative Director, is not here, but was instrumental also in helping promote this webinar today. So thank you all so much. Now, hopefully everybody on this webinar is a member of AARCH and a member of Historic Saranac Lake. But if you're not, it would be great if you would like to join us, or if you would like to contribute anything towards this webinar. I was remiss in not acknowledging our grant from the Adirondack Foundation's Generous Acts program, but this program, which is one of a 3-part series, is brought to you thanks to funding from the Adirondack Foundation's Generous Acts program. We appreciate you, Beth and William and Jason and Richard and Amy. Thank you so much for joining us. It was this afternoon and now it's this evening. So have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you, Erin. Bye, guys.